This morning we continue the journey that we began a couple of weeks ago with Abram and Sarai on the way to where God will show them. This morning we read from Genesis chapter 16. It's 16 verses. Genesis 16, beginning to read with verse 1. Please hear with me God's word. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took the Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. They slept together, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abraham, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your servant is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." And Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" "I am running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now with child, and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." Hagar gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." That is why the well was called El-Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bratt. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. This is the word of the Lord, for which we thank God. Dear friends of Jesus Christ, 2 weeks ago we joined Abram and Sarai on their journey to the place where God would show them. But last week we noticed that it's easy to doubt God's promises to lead us where God wants us to go. This week we remember how it can be also so easy to focus on the destination that God will show us that we overlook the people God puts along the way. My colleague Laura Copley says that this is a failure to see that causes so much of our text's trouble. problem in some ways begins with Sarai's poor vision She acts as though she's little more than a female body part. Sarai and her contemporaries believed children were a sign of a woman's value. What's more, God had promised Sarai and Abram that they would have many children. But now 10 years have elapsed since God made that promise. 10 years worth of Abram and Sarai being intimate with each other has still produced no children. As Copley, to whom I owe some ideas for this message, points out, all Sarai can see is emptiness and futility. Sarai, in fact, can only see one option. You see, in her culture, a woman who was infertile could give her servant to her husband to serve as a kind of surrogate mom. The woman who was infertile could then adopt the child born to her husband and servant. So when Sarai looks for solutions to her problem, she sees Hagar. When she looks for a way to help God keep God's promise, she sees Hagar. When Sarah tires of her body, her husband, and her God letting her down, she sees Hagar. Now, our New International Version translates Sarai as responding, "Perhaps I can have children through my maidservant." But as Copley points out, she more literally says, "Perhaps I can be built up through Hagar." Sarai, in other words, sees Hagar mainly as someone who can help build Sarai up and make her a worthwhile person. And so, of course, she gives Hagar to Abram. And no matter how else Abram sees Hagar, he mainly sees her as someone who can help God keep God's promises to them. And so he fully participates in Sarai's harebrained scheme. We're not surprised that the result of that faulty vision is as predictable as it is grim. When Hagar sees that Abram and she have conceived a child, her vision too blurs. Because she starts to look down on Sarai. Hagar sees that she has become what Sarai wanted to be. And so, as is so easy the case, a person of privilege looks down on the one who has lost. When Hagar measures her value against Sarai, she sees herself as superior. Hagar, the nobody, says my colleague Len Vander Zee, now sees herself and is seen by others as Hagar the somebody. Hagar the expectant mom. Hagar whose value is now been elevated because she has conceived a child. And what happens in this chain reaction of bad vision? Sarai, who now thinks of herself perhaps as a nobody, turns around and unloads her frustration on Abram. She sees the misery that she's experiencing is caused not by Hagar, but by her husband Abram. She sees Abram as the cause of her pain. And Abram responds, again, this chain reaction of faulty vision. Now, Abram sees Hagar not as the mother of his child or even of the promise, but as a problem to be solved. And he sees his wife Sarai as little more than Hagar's master who can do whatever she chooses with her slave girl. And again, another reaction empowered by both her own bitterness and Abram's giving of permission. Sarai feels free to mistreat Hagar. She afflicts her using the same Hebrew word as the way that the Egyptian masters treated and mistreated and afflicted Abram and Sarai's Israelite dependents in Egypt. You see, how we see people affects how we treat them. How we view them affects how we deal with them. Sarah sees Hagar as a slave whom she can mistreat. Abram sees Hagar as his wife's slave whom Sarai is free to afflict. And Hagar sees Sarai as her inferior whom she can now taunt. And so, like the Israelite slaves will later flee their Egyptian masters, Hagar runs away. She runs away from her nearsighted Abram and Sarai and into the wilderness. She flees to a place where there are no humans to care for, to hear her cry, or see her. Mark Knoll's book, The Civil War as Theological Crisis, analyzes the theological foundations of the Civil War. And in it, Knoll notes how people on both sides of the slavery issue use the scriptures to justify their position. So some Christians claim that African and other slaves had descended from Noah's son Shem. Slaves' dark skin as a sign that they too were to be slaves of Noah's two other sons' descendants. They viewed a person's black skin and slavery as punishment. More recently, some people have seen Jewish people's identity as license to intimidate them. Because protesters see Jewish people, first of all, as colonizers or racists, they feel free to harass them. You see, how we see people impacts the way that we treat them. Well, Abram moved heaven and earth to rescue Lot. He doesn't even lift a finger to rescue Hagar. By contrast, while Hagar has not gone looking for God, God comes looking for her. And when God's angel finds Hagar, the angel sees the person whom everyone else sees in the wrong way. As a result, the angel graces her in startling ways. It is so interesting. If you go back and read about the interactions between Abram, Sarah, and Hagar, Abram and Sarai never say her name. They see her, and they speak of her simply as maidservant or servant. But do you see what God does as soon as God sees and finds Hagar? The angel calls her by name. The biblical scholar Bruce Waltke says it's the only time that a deity addresses a woman by name in any other literature except the Hebrew Scriptures. God sees Hagar. He sees who she is and calls her by her name. God also makes these wonderful promises to Hagar, whom Abram and Sarah saw nothing that more than someone who could help them help God keep God's promises. And one of the promises sounds familiar. God says to Hagar, I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count. Does that sound familiar? It sounds a lot like God's promises to Abram. Promises of a family that's so big that he won't be able to count all of its members. And it will begin with this child of the harebrained scheme. The child Abram and Hagar have conceived together. The angel tells Hagar to name their son Ishmael because, as the angel continues, the Lord has heard of her misery. Abram and Sarah have effectively ignored Hagar's cries, but God has not. Abram and Sarah have seen Hagar as nothing but a female body part and slave, but God has not. God recognizes, sees, and hears signs of Hagar's misery and promises to bless her. But what's so interesting about what Hagar latches onto is not the promise. It's not the blessing on her, her son, and their descendants. It's that God sees her. She is shocked that God sees her as someone whom others simply view of as a slave girl, a female body part, a solution to a problem. You see, Copley points out that Hagar grew up worshiping gods who would never worship a slave, or who would never pay any attention. The gods of Egypt, never paid any attention to slave girls. They were things that could be overlooked. And so slave girls were constantly doing things to get the gods' attention. It's no wonder then that Hagar gives the Lord the name she gives God. I believe, and I'll be glad to hear differently this week, but I believe it's the only time the Bible tells us that a human gives God a name. In the Hebrew, Hagar gives God the name El-Roi, the God who sees me, and the God I see as the God who sees me. Here is great, great grace for any of us who have ever felt overlooked or ignored. Virtually everyone else in your life may ignore you, may focus on just one part of who you are, or simply act as though you're not there. God doesn't just see you, God also cares for you. In fact, God will care not just for the Abram and Sarai of the promise, but also of Hagar, the slave girl, the product of a harebrained scheme. God promises to grace Abram and Sarah with more children than they could ever count. Those children and descendants will eventually bless God's people as well as Jesus' friends, whom the Bible refers to as Abram's children. But the blessing goes even farther. It goes beyond Abram and Sarai's family. In fact, God promises to somehow bless people who won't worship the living God. Hagar is an Egyptian. Her son Ishmael will father 12 rulers. His descendants will include Arabs. God's blessings are so rich that they extend not just to God's dearly beloved people, but also all the peoples of the world. This morning, we worship a God who sees our pain that few others may see. We worship a God who in Jesus Christ hears our cries, even when no one else does. Whether you're a victim or a victimizer, God sees your pain and hears your cries. Whether you've been faithful or sometimes faithless, God sees your pain and hears your cries. Whether your family's a mess or relatively healthy, God sees your pain and hears your cries. Whether you have no children or more grandchildren than you can count, God sees your pain and hears your cries. Whether you feel visible or invisible, God sees your pain and hears your cries. Whether others have embraced you or chased you away, God sees your pain and hears your cries. Whether you find yourself this morning in some kind of wilderness or some safe space, God sees your pain and hears your cries. Whether God has kept God's promises to you or you're still waiting for God to keep God's promises, God sees your pain and hears your cries. You know, the Gospels love to describe Jesus as someone who saw and had compassion on people. Matthew 9, 14, and 16 all speak of how Jesus saw and had compassion on crowds. And in fact, even as the Romans torture him to death, Jesus sees the criminal crucified with him, and he sees his mother. In his own pain, Jesus saw people whom others easily overlooked. But as we move to close this morning, we remember that God doesn't just see our pain, that God doesn't just hear the cries of people like Hagar. God also sees the pain and hears the cry of our neighbors. God sees the pain and hears the cry of the exploited refugee and the third world mom who clutches her starving child. God sees the pain and hears the cries of Gazans and Ukrainians who are under siege and Haitians whom anarchy hounds. God hears the cries and sees the pain of the confused son and unwed teenage mother. God sees the pain and hears the cries of the grandpa whom dementia stalks and the child who is on the spectrum. God, in fact, sees the pain and hears the cries of Mr. Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and their victims. It might be worth spending some time on a snowy Sunday afternoon asking ourselves, who does God see that we overlook? And how might we be God's servants in responding to their plight and their cries?